Today, we're going to pull apart one of the most talked about cloud breaches ever, the 2019 Capital One data breach. Now, this isn't just a story about some clever hack. Oh no, it's really a cautionary tale of how a few simple, totally preventable mistakes can cascade into an absolute security nightmare. Let's dive in.
106 million. That is the number of people who had their personal data, their financial lives just completely exposed. We're talking credit card applications, social security numbers, bank accounts, the whole shebang. This wasn't just some small glitch. It was a massive failure that shook one of the most tech-forward banks on the planet to its core.
And this brings us to the central, kind of mind-bending question of this whole thing. How on earth does a security tool, a web application firewall, a WAF, whose entire job is to be a digital bodyguard, somehow become the key that unlocks the vault? That is the paradox we are going to unpack right now. So here's how we're going to do it. First, we'll just cover the basic story of what went down. Then we'll get into the technical nitty-gritty with a 4-step attack chain. After that, we'll look at why it went completely unnoticed for a shocking 118 days. And we'll wrap up with the most important part, how to actually prevent this kind of disaster from ever happening to you. Okay, first things first, let's set the scene. Because this isn't just a story about ones and zeros. It's about a person, a huge financial institution, and the millions of customers caught in the middle.
So the attacker was a woman named Paige Thompson. And get this, she was a former software engineer at Amazon Web Services, the exact same cloud provider Capital One was using. In March of 2019, she basically used her insider knowledge to take advantage of a simple cloud misconfiguration and siphoned off almost 30 gigabytes of data from over 700 of Capital One's S3 buckets.
And listen, if you take away only one thing from this, let it be this. This was not some super sophisticated zero-day attack that no one could have stopped. No way. As the quote says, every single step was based on a known, well-documented, and completely preventable configuration mistake. This was a catastrophic failure of basic security 101.
All right, now let's get a little technical and break down exactly how this went down. Think of it like a 4-step chain reaction, where each little mistake perfectly set up the next one.
So the whole thing kicked off with something called a server-side request forgery, or SSRF for short. Now, this analogy here nails it. It's like walking up to a bank teller, that's the server, and asking them to go grab a document for you. But the address you give them secretly points right to the bank's own internal vault. The teller, just doing their job, goes and gets it. That's exactly how the attacker tricked Capital One's firewall. And this slide lays out the whole playbook. First, Thompson sends that tricky SSRF request to the firewall. Second, the firewall, being tricked, reaches inside and grabs a set of security credentials. Third, and this is the real killer, those credentials belong to a role that had way too much power. And finally, armed with these God mode credentials, she could just waltz in and download everything from over 700 of their most critical data buckets. Game over.
So what was that secret internal address she sent the firewall to? It's this IP address right here. Inside AWS, this is basically a magic number that points to something called the Instance Metadata Service. It's where cloud servers get their security keys. It's supposed to be for internal use only, but that SSRF flaw was like a crack in the wall, letting the attacker reach right in from the outside and snatch them.
So you see, while the SSRF was the entry point, it wasn't really the root cause. The real disaster here was a total breakdown of what we call defense in depth. The firewall should have just blocked that kind of request, period. Its security role should never have been allowed to touch customer data. And someone, anyone, should have been monitoring for bizarre activity, like, a firewall suddenly downloading gigs and gigs of data. Fixing just one link in this chain would have stopped the whole attack cold.
As wild as the attack itself was, what happened next is honestly maybe even worse. The data was gone, and for almost 4 months, nobody at Capital One had any idea. The alarms just never went off.
Just look at this timeline. It tells a truly incredible story. The hack happens on March 22nd. A month later, the hacker's so confident she's openly bragging about it on GitHub. But it's not until July 19th, a full 118 days later, that some random security researcher stumbles on that post and decides to report it. That's how Capital One found out. Not from their fancy multi-million-dollar security systems, but from a tip.
And the really crazy part? The evidence was all there, plain as day. Standard AWS security tools should have been screaming that something was terribly wrong. Tools like GuardDuty would have flagged the weird data access. Mackie would have alerted that sensitive data was being touched. And the logs would have shown the impossible.
a firewall acting like a giant data vacuum. The signals were there, flashing red, but it seems like nobody was looking.
This quote just says it all, doesn't it? The hacker's own ego, her need to brag online, is what finally got her caught. It just shines a massive spotlight on the failure of detection here. The company was completely blind to an intruder who wasn't just in the house, but was throwing a party and posting pictures of it online for everyone to see.
Okay, so let's shift gears to the most important question of all. How do we make sure this never, ever happens again? We're going to walk through 4 key defenses that would have stopped this attack dead in its tracks.
Let's start with the most obvious error. On the left, you see the permissions the firewall actually had. Basically, the power to read data from any and all storage buckets. That is just catastrophically wrong. On the right is what it should have had: 0 data access permissions. A firewall's job is to inspect traffic, right? It has absolutely no business reading your customer data. This is called the principle of least privilege, and it was just totally ignored here.
So this brings us to the 4 big layers of defense that we're missing. First, enforce IMDS v2. That's the newer, much more secure version of that internal credential service. Second, like we just said, enforce the principle of least privilege. Don't give things access they don't need. Third, actually run your firewall in block mode so it stops attacks instead of just watching them happen. And fourth, have real anomaly detection so you can catch weird behavior the second it starts. And what's really incredible is how simple it is to plug that initial hole. This one single command you see here enforces that more secure IMDS v2. It basically slams shut the exact door the attacker walked right through. It's a simple change with a massive impact.
And hey, if the technical failures aren't enough to get your attention, here's another number for you: $80 million. That's the fine that regulators slapped on Capital One for these failures. It sent a massive shockwave through the industry, proving that cloud misconfigurations have very real, very expensive consequences.
So the bottom line is crystal clear. Just like the quote says, every single failure here was preventable. That $80 million fine wasn't just a penalty, it was a wake-up call to everyone that moving to the cloud is not a security strategy. You have to actually secure it.
And that leaves us all with one final and really important question. The Capital One breach showed the world how a couple of small, overlooked mistakes can leave your front door wide open. Every single one was preventable. So the real question you have to ask is, are you sure your front door is locked?